The chanting. I have not slept in 3 days. The beasts are here to destroy us and sacrifice us to their gods. I can't imagine us holding back while the horde crashes into the city walls. Our lives are forfeit.
Hello folks, and welcome to Dice Chatter. My name is Donnie, and today we are going to revamp the Beasts of Chaos standard Herdstone model and make a big old glorious one where many sacrifices will take place. Now, a number of months ago I did a terrain piece for the Skaven forces for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. It should pop up in the corner now. Feel free to check it out. But I bring this video up because I had a little idea to go through and create a fun terrain piece for a number of Age of Sigmar armies. So I figured I'd document the process and show you all how I make some fun scratch-built terrain centerpieces. Without further ado, let's get into the Beasts of Chaos build. For the beasts, I still wanted to pay homage to the already amazing Herdstone model. I didn't want to stray too far from that idea. I also like crafting up rocks and stones because they're easy and fun to do. So I decided I'd make some type of sacrificial Stonehenge construction. Maybe call it the Herdhenge, or the Stone. Anyways, I wanted this potential masterpiece to contain the sacrificial nature of these beasts in the center of the stones. Thrones and bones, weapons of defeated foes, and all other kinds of chaos goodness. Maybe add in a chaotic rune here and there to really show that the Herdhenge is owned by the Beasts of Chaos army. Overall, a pretty basic idea. Let's look at the supplies we will be using for this build. Now, not every supply I used in this build is on the table here, but all the main stuff I used is present. Some of the supplies I use are also not must-haves for this build. Use products you have or are comfortable using, and I am sure you will get a similar or better result. For my build, of course, you need some insulation foam, Mod Podge, joint compound, some Vallejo mud texture, miscellaneous bones and skulls, and a base of some sort for the terrain piece. And of course, lots of different paints. Let's get things started, folks. Right away, we need to figure out a base for the Herdstone henge. I have decided to use a peel and stick vinyl tile. These tiles are really easy to shape and cut down. This is also a decent replacement for MDF board if you do not have any lying around the house or no way to cut the wood. For the tile, we just peel off the sticky backing and put some Mod Podge or any other glue on the sticky side. We let that dry and then we won't have a sticky surface anymore. The only problem with these vinyl tiles, though, is their flexibility. I realized later in the build that this tile would be great for a project that mainly covers the main surface area of the whole base and not just small sections of it. But in a pinch, it works out for this build. Once everything is settled, I wanted to have a rough plan of how things were going to be set up on the base. I just drew out the areas I wanted to cut out and then beveled down the edges with a sharp blade. Once I was generally happy with the shape, I once again drew out a basic plan of where some of these big rocks were going to sit. Now, there is no need to stick to this plan. If something doesn't line up or work out, it is easy enough to cover up the drawing and change the plan. At this point in the process, things are just very fluid and there is no wrong answer for how the terrain piece can be laid out. Just go with the flow and just picture what you want the end product to look like while planning things out. Now we move on to the foam rocks. This step is where you really start seeing your project come together. To cut the foam, you have a number of ways to slice and dice to get good looking shapes. I tried out a few methods here. I have a foam cutter stick thingy majiggy that I heated up and used for a little while. I couldn't tell you what brand the foam cutter is, but to be honest, it didn't do that good of a job, and I later just gave up doing that anyways. I also mixed in your good old-fashioned sharp blade. I sliced, diced, and chipped away at these rocks with a couple blades and occasionally ripped and peeled some foam away with my fingers. This process is super cathartic and super enjoyable. The part that isn't that fun is getting little foam pieces everywhere that stick to your clothes, the floor, the other foam rocks, and down your pants. I decided to make up a handful of tall stones and slabs that would stand up and be your focal points of the terrain piece. This is really when you start to see that stone in Stonehenge start to show its true shape. The nice part about this build is the simplicity of it. Making rocks and rubble is an easy process that any amateur or beginner terrain builder like myself can tackle in an evening. It is the later steps in this build though that really make this piece stand out and fit that Beasts of Chaos theme. Once you are happy with the rocks, you can really use any type of glue you want to adhere the rocks to the base and each other. I just used some construction adhesive I had lying around the house, but really any glue, PVA, or hot glue should just do the trick fine. Just use anything that is accessible to you. Oh, and I also use some toothpicks to help line up where I want the rocks to settle. Now, this is not a mandatory step by any means, but since I was using an adhesive product that doesn't have much of an immediate drying time, I wanted the slabs of foam not to shift all over that much once I had an idea for how I wanted them to be placed. So we have our rocks set in place on the base and things are already starting to look pretty neat. Next we bring out the joint compound, my favorite tool to use when making rocks. I feel like I just gotta use this stuff in every build from here on out. It gives me the chance to be messy and I have a blast doing it. I'm using the joint compound for a few reasons here. First, I want to add more adhesion and support to the joints where the rocks are joining up to both the base and each other. Another reason is to add more weight to the overall terrain piece. I personally like my terrain to be able to withstand being bumped and stand up on its own. If a hand or model slams into the terrain piece, I just don't want it flying across the table. And the final reason is just to give the whole product just a very basic texture over the floor of the base. Eventually, you will see a muddy and bloody terrain floor, and the joint compound is a fine first step to start that process. I make sure to take my time with this step, and I also understand that this is going to take a while to dry, and that there may be some cracking. But don't you all worry, that will get covered up in some future steps. So off I go to clean off my hands and let this project sit for a number of hours. When we come back, we discover lots of cracks have accumulated on the base. This is actually completely fine and will hopefully add some interest to the terrain piece by the end of the build. With everything dry, we move on to the classic Mod Podge black coating over the entire build. A lot of foam has yet to be covered in a protective coating before we prime the model. Now I actually do this twice to the build. This isn't something you necessarily have to do, but I felt it was needed for this project since there was some bendiness with the vinyl tile base. So with everything dry, we bring out our PVA glue, some sand and stones, Vallejo mud mixture texture, skull, and some sprues with miscellaneous pieces on them. We actually go through these and try to find some interesting ones that we can add to the build. Some of them are garbage, and other ones are great, and we will definitely use them in the build. After we clip out a bunch of miscellaneous sprue pieces, we go ahead and make our PVA glue and water texture mix and spread it around the base. This is where we are going to pour our rocks and stones on just to add that little bit more of interest and detail to the build. We spread it all over the place, give it a chance to dry, and then we move on to the next step, which is spreading mud all over the place. We use the Vallejo texture mud to cover up some of those cracks or even accentuate them to kind of bring out variation in the actual floor of the build. Now, is this mud texture a must-have for this build? Probably not. Maybe if I took some more time in an earlier step when I was laying down the joint compound, I could have probably done something very similar to what I've accomplished here. Moving on over to the sprue bits, a lot of this stuff I can haphazardly place around, but with the center of the project, I want to take some more time and deliberately place items of interest. Earlier I mentioned that the joint compound messy step was my favorite part, but honestly I'm starting to think that the extreme detailing is the best part. Adding character and interest to any build is what will make it stick out from any other terrain piece you could make. I could have 25 herdstone Stonehenges and they will all generally look the same, but it is the extra detailing that will make your individual pieces stand out. We are now finally at a stage where I can get started to paint. For a painting theme, I made it just very simple. I focused on your typical gray rocks with some other colors splashed in to add extra details and realism to the stone. I mixed in some tan, orange, and even green into that rocky stone. I also even used some inks here and there to almost add this bleeding or rain-driven texture that is flowing down some of the rocks. You'll see that later once the project's all finished up. And of course, it ain't a Dice Chatter video if I don't act like a complete creep-ass. Anyways, for a majority of the technical painting practices that we use on the piece, we just really use base coating and dry brushing for just about everything. Honestly, I pretty much dry brushed the entire model, except for the smaller pieces of the terrain build. And for a majority of things, we just focus on going from darker to lightest. We start with a very dark gray and build up to lighter gray and then a touch of white on the edge of the rocks. For the floor of the piece, I wanted the dirt to, well, look like dirt and mud, so I had a main focus on browns, but I also added in a little bit of the stone color to the mud, just to kind of show that there is some correlation between the earth and the stone in the piece. So after multiple passes of different colors and dry brushing over the entire model, we are all set to move on to the tiny details. For the skulls, I just picked a crappy skull color, bone color looking paint and applied it to pretty much everything that looked like that. Painting up all these little details can really show that these goats and sheep and bulls from the Beasts of Chaos army have slayed a lot of enemies from various different factions in the Age of Sigmar Warhammer universe. And not gonna lie, it's kind of fun to put a Kharadron Overlord grenade right at the central of this herdstone. With all of those minor details fleshed out, we move on to creating some sort of rune on the front of this stone here. I didn't really like how it turned out at the end of the day, but with some washes and other crappy ink techniques that I decided to implement, I just made it look like it was bleeding down the front of the rock and, you know, it is what it is. At the end of the day, it looks pretty good. And for our final step of the entire build, well, we make a mess of things, and hopefully it doesn't ruin it by any means. We get some blood paint texture. I honestly just mixed some red and brown ink together and added some gloss varnish to it. And we go ahead and flick it and spread it all around, dab it, dash it, scrape it, do whatever we want to make this thing look like a bloody masterpiece. And after this, we move on to some glamour shots. There you have it, folks, our Beasts of Chaos terrain build. I wanted this piece to have playability on the tabletop, and I think it suits that need as well. A hero or small unit of models can easily sneak through and discover some bloody massacre. If you folks have any terrain build ideas for a number of the other Age of Sigmar factions, please let me know via the comments below or on the Dice Chatter Discord. All of my other social links and the Patreon are also in the description below as well if you are so inclined. I want to thank you all for watching, and of course, happy gaming.